There's a particular kind of championship that doesn't fit the usual narrative. Most championships, when you look back on them, tell a clean story. The best rider on the best machine, building an advantage over a season, managing that advantage, and converting it into a title that feels, by the time it arrives, like the inevitable conclusion to everything that came before it. Those championships make sense. You can draw a line from the start of the season to the end, and the line goes mostly in one direction. And then there's 1993. The 1993 500c World Championship belongs to Kevin Schwantz. And if you go looking for the clean version of that story, the one where the best rider on the best machine builds an advantage and manages it to the title, you will not find it. What you will find instead is one of the strangest, most chaotic, most genuinely unlikely championship campaigns in the history of Grand Prix motorcycle racing. A championship won not by dominance, but by survival. Not by being the most consistent rider on the grid, but by being the rider who, when everything fell apart around him, was still standing at the end. To understand how unlikely this championship really was, you have to understand who Kevin Schwantz was as a rider, because Schwantz was, by almost universal agreement among people who watched him race, one of the most talented motorcycle racers of his generation, and also one of the least consistent. These two things are connected, and understanding the connection is the key to understanding 1993. Schwantz rode for Suzuki, and the bike underneath him was the RGV500, a two-stroke V4 that, through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, had a reputation that was somewhat double-edged. The RGV500 was fast, genuinely, seriously fast, with a power delivery that, in the right hands, could do things that other machines on the grid simply couldn't replicate. But the RGV500 was also, by the testimony of people who rode it and people who worked on it, a machine that demanded an enormous amount from its rider. It wasn't a motorcycle that forgave small mistakes. It was a motorcycle that, when everything was working, rewarded total commitment with extraordinary results, and when something wasn't quite right, punished that same commitment without much warning. Schwantz and the RGV500 were, in a sense, perfectly matched. Both of them were capable of brilliance. Both of them were also capable of falling apart in ways that, on paper, looked like the same mistake happening over and over again. Schwantz's career up to 1993 had been littered with races where he was unambiguously the fastest man on the track, sometimes by a significant margin, and also littered with races where he ended up in the gravel, the barriers, or simply off the bike entirely, the victim of pushing a fundamentally unstable combination of rider and machine slightly too hard for slightly too long. His rivalry with Wayne Rainey, the Yamaha rider who had won the previous 3 world championships, had become one of the defining narratives of the sport. Rainey was almost the opposite of Schwantz in temperament and approach, where Schwantz rode with a visible, sometimes spectacular intensity, moments where the motorcycle seemed barely under control even as it was producing extraordinary lap times. Rainey rode with a controlled, almost surgical precision. Rainey didn't make the kind of mistakes that Schwantz sometimes made, not because Rainey lacked speed, but because Rainey's approach to extracting that speed left less room for the kind of small errors that, in the 500c class, had large consequences. Going into the 1993 season, most reasonable predictions would have had Rainey as the favorite. He had won 3 consecutive titles. He was riding for a factory team with enormous resources and an enormous amount of accumulated knowledge about how to win championships. Schwantz, for all his obvious talent, had a track record that included plenty of races where he simply didn't finish. And a championship campaign requires finishing races, even when you're not winning them, almost as much as it requires winning races outright. Nobody could have predicted what actually happened. The season began, and, in the early rounds, the pattern that everyone expected seemed to be holding. Rainey was fast, consistent, accumulating points with the kind of methodical approach that had carried him to 3 titles already. Schwantz was fast, too, sometimes faster than anyone else on the grid, but the consistency question remained. Some races went well, some races didn't. And then, at Misano, in Italy, in September of 1993, everything changed. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened at Misano, because it's a moment that involves something genuinely serious. A crash that ended Wayne Rainey's racing career and left him paralyzed. This isn't a footnote in the story of the 1993 championship. It's the central, unavoidable fact that reshaped everything about how that season is remembered. Rainey, leading the championship at the time, crashed during the race. The injuries he sustained were severe and permanent. His career as a rider was over in an instant, in a way that nobody watching that day could have been prepared for. What happened to the championship after that is something that has to be discussed honestly, because it's part of what makes 1993 so genuinely unusual. The points lead that Rainey had built up through the season simply stopped accumulating. He couldn't continue. The championship that had been, up to that point, primarily a contest between Rainey and a small group of challengers, including Schwantz, suddenly became something else. A contest that Rainey was no longer part of, decided by what happened in the remaining races among the riders who were still competing. This is the part of the story that makes 1993 uncomfortable to discuss in the straightforward, celebratory tone that championship stories usually get told in. Schwantz's path to the title in 1993 was shaped by something that none of the competitors wanted, by an event that nobody who was racing that day would have chosen as the mechanism through which a championship got decided. The racing itself, after Misano, continued. Because that's what happens in motorsport. Races continue. Championships continue. The season has to reach its conclusion one way or another. But the context in which it continued was permanently altered. Schwantz, in the races that remained, did what he had always been capable of doing when things were going his way. He was fast. He finished races. The accumulated points from the remaining rounds, combined with what he had built up over the rest of the season, were enough. Kevin Schwantz was the 1993 500c world champion. It is, by any measure, an unlikely championship. Not because Schwantz didn't deserve to be recognized as one of the fastest riders of his generation, because he absolutely was that, but because the path to the title involved circumstances that nobody could have designed and nobody would have wanted. A rider whose career had been defined up to that point by exactly the kind of inconsistency that championships are supposed to punish, ended up with the title in a season where the rider who had been doing everything right was removed from contention by something that had nothing to do with how either of them was actually racing. I think it's worth sitting with the discomfort of that for a moment, rather than smoothing it over, because the discomfort is part of what 1993 actually was. Motorsport, at the level Schwantz and Rainey and their competitors were operating at, exists very close to genuine danger all the time. The performance that makes the racing exciting, the speed, the commitment, the margins that separate the fastest riders from everyone else, is also the performance that, when something goes wrong in ways that can be permanent. Misano wasn't an aberration in the sport. It was an example, a particularly severe and particularly visible example of something that the sport had always carried as a possibility every single time the riders went out on track. Schwantz, in interviews given over the years since 1993, has talked about the championship in terms that reflect this complexity. There's no triumphant simplicity to how he discusses it. The title is real. It's recorded in the history books. It represents genuine achievement across a full season of competition. But the way it was completed carries weight that a normal championship victory doesn't carry. Schwantz had to finish a season, and finish it well enough to win a title, in the aftermath of something that had ended the career of a rival he'd been racing against for years, in some of the most intense and personal competition the sport had seen. What does it mean to win a championship under those circumstances? I don't think there's a clean answer to that question, and I don't think Schwantz himself has ever pretended there is one. The title belongs to him. The performances that earned the points were his performances, achieved through his own speed and his own decisions on track. But the shape of the season, The way it concluded, the absence that defined its final chapters, was not something he created and not something he would have chosen. There's something in this that I think connects to a broader truth about how we tell stories about competition and achievement. We like our championships to have a particular shape. We like the story of the season to build toward its conclusion in a way that feels earned, that feels like it makes sense as a narrative. The 1993 season doesn't have that shape, and trying to force it into that shape, trying to tell the story as if it were simply Kevin Schwantz's triumphant championship year without acknowledging what actually happened, does a disservice to everyone involved, including Schwantz himself. What I think is true, and what I think is worth focusing on, is this. Kevin Schwantz, across the whole of his career, was one of the most genuinely exciting riders the 500c class ever produced. The talent was never in question. What was sometimes in question was whether that talent could be channeled into the kind of consistency that championships require. In 1993, under circumstances that nobody wanted and nobody could have predicted, the question of consistency became moot in a way that had nothing to do with whether Schwantz had finally solved the puzzle of his own riding. He retired from racing not long after, in 1995, his body having absorbed the accumulated cost of a riding style that had never really compromised, that had always asked everything of both rider and machine in pursuit of the kind of speed that, on its day, nobody else on the grid could match. The injuries that Schwantz carried by the time he stopped racing were significant. Not on the scale of what happened to Rainey, but significant in the way that a career spent riding at the absolute edge of what a motorcycle and a human body can do tends to leave its mark. Looking back at 1993 now, from a distance of more than 30 years, what strikes me most isn't the unlikeliness of the championship itself, although it was genuinely unlikely by any measure you want to apply. What strikes me is how the season sits in the broader history of the sport as a kind of inflection point. It was, in a sense, the end of an era. Rainey's career, which had defined the early 1990s, ended that year. The 500c class itself, in the years that followed, would continue to evolve. New riders, new machines, new rivalries. But something about the specific competitive dynamic of the early 1990s, the particular intensity of Schwantz versus Rainey, ended at Misano and didn't come back in the same form. Schwantz's title, then, isn't just the story of an unlikely championship. It's also, in a way, a marker, a point where one chapter of Grand Prix racing closed and another began, marked by an event that none of the people living through it would have chosen as the dividing line. But that became the dividing line anyway, because that's sometimes how history actually works. Not in clean chapters that announce themselves in advance, but in moments that only become chapter breaks in retrospect, once enough time has passed to see the shape of what came before and what came after. The RGV500 that Schwantz rode to the championship continued to evolve in the years that followed, ridden by other riders for Suzuki's factory team, carrying forward the basic engineering philosophy that had made it, on its best days, capable of beating anything else on the grid. The motorcycle's reputation, fast, demanding, occasionally brilliant, and occasionally unforgiving, outlived Schwantz's time on it, becoming part of the broader story of two-stroke Grand Prix racing in the 1990s, an era that itself would eventually come to an end as the sport transitioned to four-stroke machinery in the early 2000s. For Schwantz personally, the 1993 title represents something that I suspect is more complicated than a simple career highlight, even though it's unambiguously the highest formal achievement of his racing career. It's the championship that proves what everyone who watched him race already knew, that on his day, with everything working, Kevin Schwantz was as fast as anyone who ever raced a 500c Grand Prix motorcycle. And it's also the championship that arrived in a season that took something irreplaceable from the sport, from a rival, and in some sense from Schwantz too, because the rivalry with Rainey had been part of what made Schwantz's own racing what it was. Rivals push each other. They define each other in ways that become visible mainly in retrospect. when that rivalry ended the way it did, something about the context that had shaped Schwantz's career ended with it. I think that's ultimately why 1993 remains such a compelling season to look back on, even, or maybe especially, because it doesn't resolve cleanly. It's a championship that was genuinely earned by a rider of genuine and exceptional talent in a season that nobody would have designed this way if they'd had any choice in the matter. It's a story about speed and talent and the particular kind of commitment that the 500c class demanded from everyone who competed in it. And it's also a story about how quickly everything in motorsport can change. How a season that looked like it was building toward one outcome can become, in an instant, a season about something else entirely. Kevin Schwantz's name is in the record books as the 1993 500c world champion. That's true, and it matters, and it represents real achievement. But the full story of that season is bigger than the entry in the record books, and I think it deserves to be told that way, with all its complexity intact rather than smoothed into something simpler than what actually happened. There's another layer to this story that I think deserves attention, and it has to do with what Schwantz's riding style actually looked like, because understanding that style is part of understanding why the championship felt so unlikely right up until the moment it wasn't. Most fast motorcycle racers, when you watch footage of them, give the impression of working within a system. Even at extraordinary speed, there's a sense of margin, of a rider operating close to the limit, but with something held in reserve, a buffer between what's happening and what would happen if things went wrong. Rainey rode like this. Watching him, you got the sense of total control, of a rider who had calculated exactly how fast he needed to go and was going exactly that fast, no more. Schwantz didn't ride like that. Watching Schwantz on a fast lap was watching someone who appeared to be operating without the buffer. The bike moved more. The corrections were larger and more frequent. There was a visible, almost theatrical quality to how close to the edge everything looked lap after lap. And the remarkable thing is that this wasn't an illusion or a stylistic flourish. It was, by every account from people who worked with him, an accurate representation of how close to the actual limit he was riding all the time. This is part of why the inconsistency existed. A rider operating with a buffer can absorb small variables, a patch of track with slightly less grip, a gust of wind, a small mechanical inconsistency, without it becoming a crisis, because the buffer exists precisely to absorb those variables. A rider operating without a buffer, riding at the actual limit rather than near it, doesn't have that absorption capacity. Small variables become big problems immediately. This is why Schwantz, on his good days, was untouchable, genuinely, visibly faster than anyone else on the grid, doing things with a motorcycle that looked like they shouldn't be possible. And it's why, on his bad days, the bad days were often very bad. There wasn't a middle gear. There was brilliant, or there was the gravel trap. The RGV500 amplified this quality rather than moderating it. A more forgiving motorcycle might have given Schwantz some of the buffer that his riding style didn't naturally include, might have absorbed some of the variables that his approach left fully exposed. The RGV500, by most accounts, did the opposite. It was a motorcycle that, when it was working, rewarded exactly the kind of commitment Schwantz brought to it, producing performance that nothing else could match. And when it wasn't working, when a setting was slightly wrong, when the tires weren't quite in the right window, when the track conditions shifted in ways the setup hadn't anticipated, it didn't soften the consequences. It sharpened them. So you had a rider with no buffer on a motorcycle with no buffer, and the combination produced exactly what you'd predict, extraordinary highs and lows that matched them in the opposite direction. Across a full season, this is a difficult profile to build a championship campaign around, because championships are won across many races, and a profile that includes the possibility of a complete and sudden zero in any given race is a profile that's structurally vulnerable to a year where someone else simply accumulates points more reliably. Which is, again, part of what makes 1993 so strange to look back on. The profile that had defined Schwantz's career up to that point, brilliant but vulnerable, was still entirely present in 1993. He hadn't transformed into a different kind of rider. He hadn't suddenly developed the buffer that had been missing. What changed wasn't Schwantz. What changed was the season itself, in a way that had nothing to do with the question his career had always been asking. I think about this sometimes in relation to how we evaluate athletes generally in any sport. There's a tendency to look at outcomes, championships, records, trophies, and read backward from those outcomes to conclusions about the person who achieved them. He won, therefore he must have figured something out. He must have become more consistent, more controlled, more complete as a competitor, because that's what winning is supposed to represent. But outcomes don't always tell you what you think they tell you. Sometimes a championship is won because a rider solved the problem that had been holding them back. And sometimes a championship arrives in a season where the problem was never solved, where the same profile that had produced wins and crashes in roughly equal measure for years simply happened to land, this particular year, in a context where it was enough, not because it had changed, but because the competition around it changed in ways nobody anticipated. I don't think this makes Schwantz's championship less real. I think it makes it more interesting and more honest than the version of the story that pretends 1993 was simply the year everything came together for him in the way championships are supposed to come together. The truth is messier than that, and the messiness is worth preserving because it's closer to what motorsport actually is. A series of events that unfold the way they unfold, shaped by talent and risk and circumstance in proportions that nobody gets to choose in advance. There's one more thing worth mentioning, which is what happened to the rivalry's place in the sport's memory afterward. For years, the Schwantz-Rainey rivalry had been one of the things that drew people to watch 500c racing. Two riders with completely different approaches, completely different temperaments, pushing each other through season after season of genuinely competitive racing. That kind of rivalry is rare, and when it exists, it elevates everything around it. Every race becomes more meaningful because of the larger story it's part of. When that rivalry ended the way it did, the sport lost something that wasn't just about results. It lost a narrative that had been giving shape and meaning to years of competition. Schwantz continued racing for a couple more seasons, but by his own accounts, and by the accounts of people around him, something about the sport had changed for him too. The thing he'd been racing against, in the most literal sense, not just Rainey as a competitor, but the entire dynamic that Rainey's presence on the grid represented, was gone. And I think it's fair to say that Schwantz's own relatively quick move toward retirement in 1995 was connected to this in ways that are hard to fully separate from the more obvious explanation of accumulated physical wear. What we're left with, looking back from today, is a championship that sits slightly apart from the others in the record books. Not lesser, Schwantz earned every point of it through his own riding in races that were genuinely contested and genuinely difficult, but different. A championship that carries the weight of what else happened that year in a way that most championships don't carry anything beyond the racing itself. There's also something worth saying about how the sport itself responded to that season, beyond the individual stories of the riders involved. The injuries that ended Rainey's career accelerated conversations about safety that had already been building through the early 1990s. Conversations about circuit design, about medical response times, about the gap between how fast the machines had become and how prepared the surrounding infrastructure actually was for that speed. Some of those conversations had been happening quietly for years. After 1993, they became considerably less quiet. It would be wrong to suggest that a single event reshaped an entire sport's approach to safety on its own, but it would also be wrong to pretend that 1993 didn't become a reference point, a season that people in the paddock for years afterward used as shorthand for exactly how high the stakes could get. For Schwantz, the championship became part of a career that, when you look at it as a whole, reads as a study in extremes. The same year that gave him his title also marked, in retrospect, something close to the end of the version of the sport he'd spent his career in. 2 seasons later, he was retired, his body having given what it had to give to a riding style that had never once, across his entire career, asked for less than everything. That's the story of 1993. Not a simple one, not a comfortable one, but a true one, and I think that's worth more than the simple version would have been. Let me know what you think down in the comments, especially if you remember watching that season as it happened. I'd love to hear what it was like at the time. We'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.